Properties, looking at the understanding of characteristics of different substances. There are two basic properties to matter. We have what we call physical properties and chemical properties. Physical properties are properties which will not change when measured. In other words, the individual atoms and molecules in a substance do not change upon measuring them. Examples of physical properties are things like length, temperature, boiling point. If I were to take a stick and measure the length of the stick, that measurement does not alter the identity or the nature of the stick. Likewise, if I take a sample of water and I measure its temperature, I'm not going to change the identity of the water that I'm measuring. You can think of a physical property, as something like understanding or identifying a person by their physical traits. If I look at an individual that I know, that individual has particular physical traits, and that's how I recognize that person, as opposed to a different person. Chemical properties are properties which will change when measured. We actually will see a shift in the atoms or molecules of the substance as the chemical property is measured. It changes the composition of the substance. Examples of chemical properties are things like flammability. For example, gasoline is flammable, it will burn. Or oxidative potential, something like iron can rust. Chemical properties are more like wind. We can see the effects of the wind, but not the wind. If I look at the wind, I don't see individual air particles moving. What I see is a tree blowing by the movement of those air particles, for example. Now, if we try to distinguish between physical and chemical properties, all substances will display both physical and chemical properties. So if I look at something like gasoline, gasoline has a particular color to it. That is a physical property. But its ability to burn, its flammability, is a chemical property. Substances will also display what we call intensive and extensive properties. Intensive properties are properties which are independent of the amount of the substance. So intensive is independent. That means it does not matter how much substance I have, the property will remain the same for that particular substance. Examples of intensive properties are things like density, boiling point, melting point. The density of copper will be the same regardless of how much copper I have. If I take a penny or anything that's made of copper and I take 1 gram of that versus 100 grams of it, the density of both samples will be the same. 1 gram of water will boil at 100 degrees Celsius. 100 grams of water will boil at 100 degrees Celsius. There is no difference between them, despite the difference in the amount of substance. Extensive properties, as you probably guess, are the opposite. They are dependent on the amount of the substance. Examples of extensive properties are things like mass or volume. A gram of a substance is not equivalent to a kilogram. They are different amounts. So if I were for example, to combine 50 grams of water at 25 degrees Celsius with 75 grams of water at 25 degrees Celsius, what will the result be? If you guess what this is going to be, if you add them up, you're going to wind up with a mass of 125 grams. Because mass is extensive, it depends upon the amount, so that would be additive. However, the temperature is intensive, which means it will not depend on the amount of the substance. Since both substances are at the same temperature, the final temperature will be the same at 25 degrees Celsius. So mass is extensive, temperature is intensive. Looking at changes in matter, because properties can change from one state to another. When we look at changes in matter, we study both the composition of a substance as well as its behavior of the matter. Matter will undergo changes in its chemical and its physical properties. Physical changes are changes like melting ice, freezing water, boiling water. They change the appearance of the substance, but do not change its identity. It remains chemically unaltered. Chemical changes will change the identity of the substance. Something like a chemical reaction. We alter the substance by adding or removing or rearranging atoms in the composition of what we're looking at. Combustion of methane. If we take methane gas and burn it, that will create new substances. We'll take a reaction of methane and oxygen gas and produce carbon dioxide gas and water. Electrolyzing water, running an electrical current through water, can produce the separation into its component hydrogen and oxygen gases. So if we look at some examples of different processes, if we burn coal, if we evaporate acetone, if we flatten copper, if we see the fading of dye, what would each of these be, physical or chemical changes? You would probably guess coal burning would be a chemical change. Acetone would be probably a physical change. The copper would also be a physical change. The dye is a little tricky. You see the fading of the dye, it looks like it changes its appearance, but we have to consider that dye is a chemical substance, and its fading is caused by destruction of that substance. This is the reason why leaves change color. The chemical chlorophyll, which makes the leaf green, breaks down, and as it disappears, it reveals underlying pigments like browns and greens and reds. So we see that A is a chemical change, B is a physical change, C is a physical change, and D is a chemical change. Now, chemical changes can be hard to identify because we can see similar processes in a chemical change and a physical change. So the only way to identify a chemical change is by a physical change, because changes of a substance from one thing to another will automatically produce new properties, and those properties, those physical properties, will be different from the physical properties of the starting substance. But the trick then remains in figuring out whether the change in the physical nature of the substance is simply a physical change, like evaporating water, or a chemical change, like the reaction of baking soda and vinegar, which also produces a gas, like boiling water does.